Коллеги, добрый день. Меня зовут Алексей Гусев. Я являюсь директором.
Colleagues, good afternoon. My name is Alexei Gusev. I'm Director for Innovation Ecosystem Development of the RVC, Russian venture company. I'm moderating the session on the cluster topic. It's entitled Technology Capital, Innovation Clusters and Their Role in the Economic Development of the Global City. We have with us Alexei Fursin, Head of the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Development Department for the City of Moscow, Eldar Hayrulin, Director of the International Medical Cluster. We have two people online, Evgeny Kutsenko, Director of the Russian Cluster Observatory, which collects information on cluster, and Christian Kettles from TCI Network, the most important international expert group that unites sort of clusters of network. He's kind of our main international expert on the cluster topics. Okay, colleagues, we have a very interesting dialogue ahead of us between all participants here. On top of that, we'll be having questions from our online audience. We're working in a hybrid format. I hope I will get these questions on my screen here. And also, I will have a number of questions to you. The first thing that I want to say, I'd like to thank the organizers of the Urban Forum and the government of Moscow, which supports this forum. In our current situation, it's particularly important to not stop the fruitful debates that we have started a while ago on the development of the city of Moscow and other cities, something that we've been discussing during the Urban Forum, and particularly this topic of clusters. Moscow Innovation Cluster is an important project in this regard, and Alexei Fursin will talk about that later. And at the same time, the external situation is changing. The Moscow Innovation Cluster was launched long before the pandemic, and according to a different economic model compared to the one that exists today. And in the world, this issue of clusters has existed for quite a while. Here's my first question to all speakers. From your point of view, all these changes that take place now, how does it change our attitude to clusters? For example, we all see that the role of space mobility is changing. It's a trivial thought, but many people are switching online, working remotely, and for a cluster, an important point is that these assets are located next to one another. Technoparks and other innovative infrastructure elements are quite close, which allows companies to more efficiently build trust, reduce transactional costs and things like that. But these things are changing now, and there are also factors that are connected to support measures. I am a victim, in a sense, of this reform of the development institutions. Well, victim may be too strong of a word, but in any sense, the situation with the support of innovative companies and business is changing gradually. And to me, there are important factors that can impact our cluster policy. That's how I'm going to be asking my questions. And first, let me give the floor to Alexei Fursin. And my main question to you is this. The Moscow Innovation Cluster plays a huge role in Moscow. 15,000 Moscow companies. It's a little under 10% of the entire Moscow economy in terms of revenues. This is a big segment of Moscow business. All right. How is it changing compared with your original expectations formulated in 2015-2016? What are your expectations of the future? These are my two key questions. What's changing and what are your plans in terms of adjusting of the concept, original concept, considering the changing circumstances? Mr. Fursin. All right, I welcome all participants in today's session and our entire forum. Few people may know that the urban forum here used to be a place where the idea of the Moscow Innovation Cluster was born. In 2018, there was this study on agglomerations, and some conclusions were made that agglomerations are connected with the innovation sectors in those agglomerations. And back then, they looked at huge metropolises or agglomerations where innovation clusters were being developed. They could call them differently: economic zones, some individual preferential treatment areas, or clusters. We used foreign experience. Back then there was this initiative of Mayor Sobyanin and the president to come up with this Moscow Innovation Cluster. And to answer your first question, what we meant to do, back then Moscow had an extensive innovation infrastructure, all sorts of techno parks, special economic zones, industrial complexes, certification centers. Moscow, as the capital, is the center of many research centers and universities here in the country. It is here that the main IT companies are located that are the driver of everything in this innovation agenda. But back then, they were all working in silos, in their own little space, without noticing other stakeholders in the same environment, in the same street. I don't mean literally, but this is how it was developing. And it did have an impact on those connections, both vertically and horizontally. The big ones failed to notice the small ones. Education failed to notice industry or science. Science failed to see commercialization. It wasn't that bad, but we had a powerful but sort of disintegrated or separated infrastructure. And then a decision was made to unite it all, to show that we all exist, and it has to be turned into this single cluster platform for those ties to be built. As I was preparing to this session, I compared our cluster, our anthill, with big corporations. This is what's happening in the last 2 or 3 years. Even if we look at foreign giants or Russian giants, when a bank is no longer just a bank, but they do delivery, they do educational projects, they have a pharmacy. It's a huge ecosystem and allowing everyone to grow. The small ones that merged and the big ones increase their presence, and we get more and more such ecosystems. In my understanding, our Moscow Innovation Cluster is this big ecosystem. But still, they were within the system, and then they had their own interests. And now, on to your second question. about our future and goals. Now we need to form the glue that will connect all this together. We're building services and instruments that will allow all these different players to get connected. Okay, when a small startup will be noticed by a big corporation, something that's otherwise impossible. And in this situation, the corporation itself says, okay, we have this corporate task, but we want other small companies to come and offer us solutions, small innovation companies. And that's why we began to build digital resources. And each project that works in the cluster has both digital and human profile. At this point, behind any digital service, there's a group of people, there's a team that's doing it. So in any case, you can have the contract manufacturing exchange, and it works automatically, but there's a team behind it that makes its operations possible. Now our goal is to maximize the number of links. At the end, we need to get a product as a result of this cooperation. At the end, of course, you could say, what is a product? Is it something patented or some kind of research results? But also, it's about whether it makes economic sense or not. And of course, at the end, it has to turn into the economy of the company, of the city, of its people. Our main KPI is the number of innovations in the form of products, solutions, software, new equipment. It's the number of people and businesses involved in that, and also the amount of money around those projects that will be implemented in clusters. All right. You use this metaphor of glue, that a cluster is like that glue. What are the elements of what you already built? We're talking about Moscow and IS services and other tools. What works better? And what do we need to get in the nearest future? That's my second question about the plans and how the cluster structure will be changing due to some external consequences. What works better? What works better? Okay. There are some projects that are connected to the market discovery, and there may be this market that was not accessible to the innovators. These are accelerators and complexes where the client is a big private company, a bank or a state corporation, and Yandex. On the other hand, there are hundreds of innovators that take part. Hundreds come and dozens are selected, and at the end they are included into those teams, and when there are transactions, there's just a few companies. This is the funnel that we have, but this is how small companies get access to the big market of private companies. Another important project, it's both private and public, it's what they call piloting sites. You come with your product and you say it's so innovative and everyone believes you, but then now you need to prove it. And how can you prove it? You can prove it by testing it, piloting it, so that we would be able to understand its features and its real innovative value. So it's not just a copy of something that exists. And today we have the government and the public sector participating in it, where the innovator can select its product and they can come up with certain terms and deadlines, and then it's not just about giving a site for testing. At the end, if the product is good, this company that provides the piloting space also purchases the product. There's some simplified way of doing it. Yes, we try to remove the human factor there. It all takes place on the platform. You need no additional regulations or certifications. Just come with your innovation to this platform. This is not something that we invented. It's been tried in Europe before, and sometimes we can even try working on the international level. You are in Moscow and you try your product in Barcelona, or you are in Berlin and you pilot it in Moscow. There are no geographical borders for innovations. It's very important to connect the innovations with the international market. In some products, we can say that the government sector and domestic market can ensure the consumption of this innovation for a while, but after a certain period of time, this innovative company will have to go beyond Moscow and Russia. What's new here? We are following this journey, and the innovations are not something that's done by state-run corporations or startups. It's done by specific people, individuals, and that's why we are working on attracting people who would be able to come up with those innovations. We teach them to protect their IP and teach them how to commercialize it. We explain to them how they can use the innovation structure of the city labs, patent support and certification centers, so that they would be able to create it all and use their creativity for some financial results. All right, thank you. I think at the end we will have some questions, and perhaps there will be questions to you. And then now I'd like to give the floor to Christian Kettles. Christian is connected to us online. Let me start by the same question that I asked Alexei. But this one, it's not about Moscow, but rather it's about global clusters that are part of TCI network. Christian Kettles, in your opinion, of all those criteria and approaches that worked 10 years ago, when it all started in Russia, this cluster story, when our clusters began to join TCI. So compare 10 years ago and now. What has changed? Which approaches proved useful, and which ones are you predicting for the nearest future due to the external economic situation and how geography is no longer that important, and in the past it was important for clusters? Okay, Christian, you have the floor, please.
Well, thank you, Alexei. It's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. I would only hope to be also physically in Moscow, but I hope that will happen soon in the future again. Now, to evaluate the progress of the Russian clusters and the Russian cluster policies, I think, you should probably better ask my Russian colleagues that are studying exactly this, year by year. What I can see from the outside is that Russia has become much more sophisticated in terms of kind of collecting data, understanding the processes, and also thinking about the role of clusters in innovation and overall economic development. So I think there is much better infrastructure, much better thinking around how to do this. Now, the key question is, of course, how do you apply these type of ideas? And I think the key challenge for all of us, not only in Russia at the moment, is figuring out how the pandemic is affecting the role that clusters and cluster organizations can play. Now, I think what we've seen in our global network is that in the initial crisis response, a lot of people thought that, this is about public health and it's about macroeconomic responses so that the economies kind of don't go into cardiac arrest. There's no room for supply side instruments like cluster organization. But it actually turned out that clusters in many places were extremely critical. And they were critical because they have some assets that others don't have, that make them unique as an intermediary. And I think that also came out in the comments that we just heard about the Russian innovation cluster. They have the linkages with the local business community, and they have the trust of many of the business leaders in those clusters. And what that allowed them to do is react much more flexibly in the discussion with these business leaders, both on how to help them survive, but also on how to mobilize the economic community and companies and manufacturing and so on for PPP equipment and things like that very quickly in the crisis response. So that was in the immediate crisis. Now, as we think about getting out of this crisis and moving forward, I think the question, of course, is, will clusters still be there? I do agree with you, Alexei, that the role of geography is kind of, being put to its test again. But my sense is that does not mean that clusters will be less important in the future. It will probably mean that they change their nature as they have changed their nature over the last 20, 30 years. Clusters are now much more internationally connected through global value chains and so on. But there is a certain type of activity, especially connected to innovation, where geographic proximity, I'm convinced, still plays a critical role. Now, we need to observe that, and we see what the data tells us, but I think, I would be very surprised if that goes away. The other point, and that's more to clusters as a policy instrument, is I think exactly what we just heard in the discussion about the Moscow Innovation Cluster. There is a need to do two things. One is provide an intermediary service to these new emerging ecosystems, innovation ecosystems, industrial ecosystems in many new fields where different players have to get together. There's collective action that needs to happen, and somebody needs to help orchestrate that. That's more necessary than ever. And so the type of actions that cluster organizations provide, I think, are more needed than ever. And the second part, which also came out, I think, in the Moscow example, is on the side of government. I think what we see more and more in many places around the world is that we need to get better at integrating the functional special departments that many cities and regions and national governments have. One is focused on skills, and one other on infrastructure, and one on innovation, and one on SMEs, and one on export promotion, FDI attraction. Somebody has to integrate that and bring that together with the comprehensive understanding of what your competitive advantages in this location are and what this cluster needs. And that's exactly what cluster organizations, I think, can provide. And that will be, as I said, probably even more important in the future than it has been in the past, because a lot of things around us are changing. And this is really a time where clusters and companies and regions have to rethink their strategy and kind of have to reestablish where they are and what they are competing on. Alexander, do you want me to continue and talk a little bit about some international examples, or you want to pose another question?
Если позволите, я бы, наверное, уточнил.
If you allow me, I would clarify concerning your latest statement. You said that the role of a special public organization inside the cluster, as you've mentioned, may grow, may expand and become more critical as compared with the previous time, because when we spoke about a cluster, there was always an option. Some of the clusters were naturally grown, and some of the clusters, I wouldn't say artificially created, but with a big support from the state. And in the context of what you've said about the increasing role of those dedicated cluster organizations, especially those funded by the state, how the situation will change. On the one hand, we have naturally grown clusters, and on the other hand, we have, let's say, artificially created clusters supported by the state. Do you think the situation will change?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I would maybe differentiate more according to kind of what's the need for change. You know, if you have what you called an artificial cluster, it basically means, you know, we want to transform the situation. There's probably very little at the moment, and we have big ambitions for this type of sector and that type of activity. And so I think the whole effort is to kind of transform the business environment in this cluster, attract economic activity, making sure that something happens. I think in that type, you know, you need to, in that type of situation, you need a lot of integration of different policy instruments at the disposal of the government. You need a strong entity that provides that, and it's natural that that is a government player rather than a private sector player, because there isn't much to coordinate. If you are in a stable situation, you know, a strong cluster that has a set strategy, it's clear how it's competing. I think then it's more about what are the specialized services that government agencies provide. In that type of situation, there's potentially less need, excuse me, for strategy. There's less need for kind of integrating activities. And so, you know, the cluster organization can be maybe more also a private sector networking organization to do that. What I would argue is that independently of whether you are a new cluster or, you know, what you call a created cluster or an existing one, we are now in a time of accelerated change, driven at least in part through the pandemic. And so I think the need for strategy and the need for integrated thinking in terms of the policy instrument that we provide is higher than before. That doesn't necessarily have to come through a strong government entity, but I think it needs a government-supported entity, because otherwise, you know, these private sector cluster organizations themselves will have a hard time to mobilizing the type of policy support that's needed in this era.
Спасибо большое, Кристиан, за ответ на этот вопрос.
Thank you very much, Christian, for the answer to this question, and a very short question to follow up the presentation of Alexey Anatolovich. Would you recommend something? Maybe you might highlight just one recommendation which could be provided for such clusters as Moscow Innovative Cluster. Or if you do not have similar recommendation, maybe you still have something like tips and tricks, something what you can see based on the experience of TCI network participants, some recommendation to Moscow, to Moscow Innovation Cluster.
Well, I mean, I do think there, you know, I don't know the specific situation in Moscow well enough to kind of give very clear advice to the colleagues. So that's not my position. But I can share some observations, of course, from other locations and what we've seen there. I think one key question is really, how do you integrate what you do at the cluster level with the activities that you pursue at the city level in terms of kind of cross-cutting competitiveness? I think the examples of successful efforts that really move their regions forward are ones where you not only think about your cluster as kind of a standalone entity, an island, if you will, but more as a sort of an icebreaker, you know, the tip of the spear that allows for changes, and whether it's in the perception of the location or in the business environment condition or the attraction of foreign companies, but enables changes that benefit not just the cluster, but the broader competitive positioning of the city. And so that means as a cluster manager, you have to think about your role not just in serving your direct audience, your direct stakeholders, which are the people in the cluster, but you really have to think about your role in the broader city economy. The other issue is connected more with the connection between the city and the country. I think Moscow obviously is economically very dominant in Russia, plays a key role, but still you are part of Russia. And I think a lot of what you can do and what you can't do in terms of your economic growth path is shaped by the nation that you are part of. And so I think it is important to really think through what's your relationship with national policies, where can you leverage what the nation is offering, where can you play complementary roles as a city, how can you leverage the regions around Moscow or connections with other Russian cities. Moscow is not competing globally on its own. It is competing as a part of Russia. And I think that's an important part to keep in mind as you think about the right ambitions and the right actions that you want to take for your cluster organizations too.
Спасибо большое, Кристиан. Дальше я хотел...
Christian, thank you so much. And currently I would like to pass the floor to Evgeny Kutsenko, who is a director of the cluster laboratory of the High School of Economics, and he is the head of the leading center which analyzes the cluster problematics. Evgeny is online. Could we switch to the screen with Evgeny? We are very happy to greet you here. Can you hear me well, by the way? Can you see my presentation? Yes, and I also have a question about the changes. And when we speak about the word observatory, it's from the word observer, observe. That means that you are currently observing the situation with clusters. What do you see based on statistics, based on your regular feedback from Russian clusters? And what do you think specifically about the Moscow Innovation Cluster? Because today we speak about it first of all. The floor is yours. Alexei, thank you very much. What can I say? We have quite good clusters. Moscow Innovation Cluster and also Moscow Medical Cluster. I think they are very good projects which are also driving our trends. But first of all, I would like to greet everyone, to congratulate with the beginning of the forum. And I would like to say that in different cities we have different cluster models developing. Currently, I am not going to dive deeper into details. We do not have such an options, but I would like to mention that Moscow is quite specific because our key clusters are, first of all, flagship mega super projects of the government of the city. And when we unite a great number of participants, and I'm speaking about the Moscow Innovation Cluster, we need to understand that this is a tool to achieve the goals of the country. And that's why we need to understand why do we create such clusters and what would we like to achieve, not tomorrow, but 10 years afterwards. What is the landscape of Moscow? How will it change? And that's why we had a survey. We spoke about Moscow as the center of innovation, and we had 35 KPIs taking into account different parameters. Last year, we published a rating among all the 35 cities, and Moscow was on the 8th place in the rating of HSE GCII. And why we use that? We need to understand the profile and the weak points and to suggest the specific measures to overcome them. This report has been already published. It is available online at the moment. I will not dive deep into details. We have a lot of analytics and proposals there, but it also covers the key challenges. The first challenge: Moscow is indeed a city of startups. We need to get used to that, and if you were not aware about this, you should know that now, you should learn it. So it's a center of startups, but we still see the deficit of some large technological corporations. For example, Gazprom moved to St. Petersburg, and this is one of the companies which is listed in thousands of innovations, the company which spends a lot for R&D. And we also do not see unicorns. They are in deficit. It's a very rare animal. And I will tell you that geography doesn't change, as Alexei mentioned. On the other hand, geography is more important than ever. You can see that we have half of startups and 3/4 of unicorns. That means that the best companies are very picky when they select their location. The second challenge, yes, we are the capital of startups, but we have some lack of venture investments. I know that Moscow Innovation Cluster, Venture Academy, all that institutions work, but nonetheless, we cannot change the situation in one night. Number 3, Moscow is already the global center for the representatives of IT companies. You know that international IT companies should have their subsidiaries or representative offices in Russia, and I will inform you that Moscow has already fulfilled that requirement. Moscow is currently in top 6. And from 1,000 in Fortune 500, already many of the companies opened their representatives' offices in Moscow. But unfortunately, only a low share of R&D subdivisions were opened here in Moscow. Here you had the example of Shanghai, which was able to become the center of R&D divisions of all the international companies from all over the world. I think we should also use that experience, and that we need to ensure that we will work further on the digital agenda. Here we see the number of free of charge Wi-Fi points, but that's good on the one hand, but afterwards we had a look also at the patent profile, and it turned out that we are only on the 20th place among the cities which we compared. And that means, are we selling or are we buying? That means we need to understand it. Number 5, Moscow universities are very well known in the world. For example, our national programs like 5100 and so on. Here we have Moscow, which is having the 5th place among the cities with universities which are included in top 3 of the leading institutes. But in Moscow we have only 5 people among of the 6,000 highly quoted scientists. So this is the same story as with unicorns. It means that we need to attract real stars, celebrities. When we speak about our education, we see that mathematics and physics are our strong sides, but we have the risk to ignore the most intensively growing parts in the cities. Do you know what is growing most intensively? Medicine. And we have a lot of publications which are related to medicine. And unfortunately, the cities of our sampling introduce more than Boston. 40% all of the publications of Boston University is related to medicine. In Asia, we also have pretty high figures. In Tokyo, we have 27% of articles related to medicine, and in Moscow, we have only 7%. Currently, if Darren Dusevich, we will talk about Moscow medicinal cluster, and this will probably contribute to the resolution of this situation. But we understand that it takes time, and what's important, not to give up, to proceed. And the similar story we can see in the artificial intelligence. For example, here you can see that Moscow is on the 2nd place if we look at the number of publications growth. Then, Moscow is a creative and intellectual hub. Here is the matrix. You can go through that. And Moscow is also within 10 top cities concerning development of creative infrastructures and industries. But, Sergei, you mentioned about dilution of the cities. But half of the far-fetched information, according to far-fetched information, fashion brands are not here. We are lagging behind New York, for example. Let's also think about cinematography. I doubt that Hollywood will disappear somehow or will move to some other place. But we need to understand what are our weak places and what we need to enforce. Evgeny, I will jump in. Please remember about the schedule. You have very interesting information. It's clear we won't be able to digest everything what you are talking about. Could you please focus on some key recommendations, probably? In the title of your presentation, we saw that you had questions and answers part. Okay, I will spend just 1 minute more of your time. In general, we have 48 recommendations. They are already listed in our report, and we united them and aggregated them in these 6 big directions. Probably those directions or areas look quite abstract, but behind those abstract notions, we have specific measures and actions. First of all, you need to attract celebrities. It's not metro, it's not infrastructure. That's why we need to be attractive to the other people. And when we speak about the development of the medicinal science, medical products on CT, for example, this is the most important thing when we speak about clusters. We need to connect different areas. I do not have time to enlist everything. And the latest UNESCO report, in its conclusion, said that all the countries face the problem that business is not interested in developing of science. They are interested only in purchasing some ready solutions. And I think that it's not a problem for other cities, but it's a problem for Moscow also. But I'm sure that Moscow will be able to find the way out of this. We need to focus on safety and environment, and we need to think about the new international image of our city. Those are big goals, and I think that it's clusters which engage hundreds or even thousands of participants, which would create new interactions, new collaborations, and TCI is also included into Skolkovo cluster. I believe those participants should become the drivers, and they need to drive the movement.
All right, thank you, Evgeny. To save time, I'd like to ask you lots of questions, but I don't think we need to do that, because pretty soon the next session will start, and we have one more important speaker, Eldar Khairulin. Let me give you the floor. He is the director of the International Medical Cluster in Moscow. We got some interesting data in terms of the ranking of Moscow in medical sciences, and maybe you will comment on that. And let me also ask you a question. Because of the pandemic and also because of other factors, there's this opinion that in 2010s, IT companies were dominating among the fastest growing companies, and digital technologies were the main drivers of the scientific progress. Then in the 2020s, it will be the medical tech. What do you think about that opinion, and comment on some of the data in Evgeny's presentation? The role of medicine and biotech will be increasing and has increased. It's really high. Everyone understands how important that is and how it is attractive in terms of investments. This trend really works, and we feel that our investors became interested in that area. As you said, we were specifically created for that purpose. In 2014, we realized that more than 200,000 residents of Russia go abroad to receive treatment abroad. And then we came up with this idea to create an organization where we would be able to use foreign medical practices without additional certification and registration. There was a special law passed for our operations, and we began operating in 2015. It's all about the development of medical technologies, transfer of educational, bio, and medical technologies, and how to commercialize it all. At early stages of our development, we analyzed technoparks and biomedical clusters of the world together with Evgeny here, and we realized that the main success factors for clusters they were based on 4 components. You need to offer them comfortable environment so that it's interesting for them to be there. Number 2, we need to ensure there's this interaction. We need to help them merge their interests. 80 to 90% of their tasks will have to be performed by the participants themselves, and we have a number of successful cases there. Then it's about the support of the regions and the federation and special regulatory framework which allows us to get breakthrough areas of activities, and then it's the managing company itself which ensures streamlining and harmonization for all the cluster members. As a managing company, we want to develop this service model, and that's what Alexei mentioned as well. And we think we are a kind of a system which includes our participants and our investors, and there's this other layer, sort of super system layer, which includes additional players. It can be based on the fact that in terms of the territory, we are part of the Skolkovo cluster, and some companies from the Skolkovo Technopark will move to our Technopark and will be manufacturing some medical devices and high-tech products. The government of Moscow, as our founders, is another component. In that sense, we are part of the Moscow healthcare system and also part of the Moscow innovation cluster. And here there is an intensive interaction with state-run medical organizations, the Moscow healthcare department. There are lots of educational programs, and there are architectural principles that we used to design our hospitals. Considering the foreign regulations now, these principles are used in Moscow when certain buildings are constructed. For example, we offered 24 basic design principles that we borrowed from other countries, France and Israel. They have been implemented in our new sanitary rules. Also, we have some flagship hospitals where our investors invest, and they, MedScan, MedC, and MedInvest Group are building their medical centers. Thus, the success of our cluster is when all these additional stakeholders interact and there's balanced development. Okay, as for medical sciences for Eugene, it's about publications, but when you interact with scientific organizations, how can you make it stronger? How can you make medical science stronger in Moscow using your cluster? How to respond to the challenge that Evgeny presented? All our applicants, by definition, describe both educational and R&D components of their project. If something is already used abroad, it has to be mentioned by our applicants. We are willing to become a place where such foreign technologies could be tested at the level of clinical trials. We interact with federal R&D centers, with the city-level hospitals, and there are projects to introduce innovations in the work of nurses, and there are new projects on molecular oncology. We develop new forms of management of medical organizations in terms of their safety and security, patient-oriented systems. Eventually, we need to get to the sustainable development of our participants and medical organizations. Thank you, Alexei. Maybe you may express some ideas about the Moscow medical cluster, and after that we will end our discussion. The topic is interesting, but we are running out of time. You gave this good example of this Moscow medical cluster. And Christian was talking about natural and artificial ones. The main task of artificial clusters is to turn the artificial into the natural. It's all about the needs of those cluster participants. If what they need is the use of solutions in the healthcare system, it doesn't matter whether it's artificial or natural. You will always have this team, and how you can use your ideas all the way down to giving your services to a specific individual. The same for other clusters. If we can meet a certain demand of a participant, it's no longer artificial, it's already natural. Okay, thank you. Colleagues, we need to wrap up our session. I would like to thank all the speakers and all online listeners. Special thanks to those who joined us online. And from Christian Kettles, let me tell you that there's a presentation. Christian has a set of slides, and it will be available to all participants, but because there's lots of interesting data and the examples that Christian is using on top of what's been said. Thank you, distinguished colleagues, and have a great forum here at the forum. Goodbye.